Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our roundtable with Ari Melenciano on artificial intelligence and art, reflections on language, myths, and culture. But before I say a few words on our event and the organizers, I'd like to remind everyone about the land we occupy. Respectfully acknowledge that Montclair State University occupies land in Lenape-Hoking, the traditional and expropriated territory of the Lenape. As a state institution, we also recognize and support the sovereignty of New Jersey's three state-recognized tribes, the Ramapo Lenape, Nanticoke, Lenni Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape nations. We recognize the sovereign nations of the Lenape diaspora elsewhere in North America, as well as other indigenous individuals and communities now residing in New Jersey. By offering this land acknowledgement, we commit to addressing the historical legacies of indigenous dispossession and dismantling practices of erasure that persist today. Recognize the resilience and persistence of contemporary indigenous communities and their role in educating all of us about justice, equity, and the stewardship of the land throughout the generations. Now, a few introductory words. Our guest is a featured artist in the University Gallery's exhibition, The Backend, using artificial intelligence as an artistic medium and as a tool for social inquiry. Her art and research practice are deeply invested in studying consciousness as a mythopoetic technique for unveiling the collective unconsciousness in her studio practice by drawing on anthropological approaches with AI. Through interrogations of notions of truth and objectivity, her work reveals the influence of myth and humanity, which humanity is rooted in, as well as how the power dynamics of language are being automated by AI. Ari Melenciano reflects on her work in a conversation with Montclair faculty, including Charlotte Kent, who is an associate professor of visual culture in the Department of Art and Design, and Julian Brash, who is a associate professor of anthropology. This event is presented by University Galleries and Research on Interdisciplinary Global Studies, or short, RIGS. RIGS is a faculty-driven initiative that's a fluid network of scholars here at Montclair, and the scholars hail from a variety of disciplines, fields, and areas. And RIGS aims to provide opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration, research support, and research sharing. It also aims at highlighting the global interconnectedness and the impact of faculty scholarship, as well as showcasing the university's expertise and engagement through scholarly achievements, research, events, and activities. The event is also supported by the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Departments of Anthropology, Art and Design, Justice Studies, Religion, and Sociology. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Alyssa Villaseñor, who is the University Gallery's program coordinator, to say a few words about her organization before opening the floor to our esteemed guests and faculty members. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnaud, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Alyssa. I'm the Engagement Outreach Coordinator of the Montclair State University Galleries. And thank you, Riggs, for partnering with us on this event, and for Ari, Charlotte, and Julian for being part of it. This discussion is offered as part of our programming for the Backend, which is our fall exhibition in the Siegel Gallery that examines the protocols and agreements that shape our society and the framework of our participation. We are going to have a Q&A at the end of this conversation, so any questions that arise, just drop them in the chat below. But other than that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists.
Welcome, Ari. I think if it's possible, we had thought that it'd be great for you to start off by discussing a little bit of your work and sharing some of the work that is in the gallery for those who haven't yet had the opportunity to see the works themselves in person, which will be on view for the rest of the semester. So with that, can I invite you to do that?
Yes, and Alyssa, I believe you will be controlling. Perfect. Okay, so I think we can start here. This is work that I did about a year ago. So some context, it was about October of 2022, and it felt like the world, my immediate world, was just exploding of so many conversations around Gen AI. And I was also working inside of a very large tech company and exploring a lot of what does it mean to create personalized models with technologies like Dream Booth, and then also what does it mean to be able to create hyper-realistic photo imagery of anyone, of all sorts of identities, and just really feeling this moment of there's a huge shift that's happening. And so for me, the way that I wanted to explore it was, well, what is it? What is this? Like, what's happening? What happens when I use certain words to do things, and really just study it as opposed to just getting in and creating, and being very intentional and mindful about what I'm doing. So on the left, what you see are images that I've created. And maybe you have some closer up, Alyssa, in the other slides, like this one. Okay, so what I did, I would upload images of myself, or upload one single image, top left, the original, a headshot that I had. And then what I would do is I would use that as the image inside of a probably Stable Diffusion, some generative AI tool. And then I would add words as prompts, single words or a couple words, just as attributes, to see how did it change my appearance and phenotype and way of presenting myself based off the word. And for me, that was a practice in understanding the worlds that exist around words, like the metadata, and how that metadata then impacts the images that we create. So why is it that if I say the word Miami, it'll change my appearance in this way, like darken my complexion, add makeup a bit, show teeth in my smile. If I say successful, it will have makeup look a little differently, also show my teeth. If I say drinks tea, it'll make me look like I'm from Asia. Like, also, if I say programmer, it'll change my race and my gender. Like, what is it doing, and how does it understand the words that are inside of this large language model? And really understanding that that's just a reflection of the way that we have used words as a dominant society, and its ability to only really find what is most popular about our activity online. And so this was very reflective of that. I think I have another slide that kind of shows a little bit of more of these identities, or this one. So what I did outside of the identities was then also go into the public domain. And I wanted to explore how well it could recreate the archive. Like, what does it know about our history based purely off of our language or in our captions? And so for this one, what I did was go into the public domain, which are all Creative Commons images that anyone can use with no copyright infringement. And then I would use the caption of the different images and use that solely as the prompt inside of these AI tools. And prompts are just it's the new coding language, basically. Within AI tools, if you want to create an image, all you do is write a few words, and then it'll create an image based off the words you use. So for this one, I said a photograph of Benjamin Pap Singleton, 1880. And so it was able to recreate that image very well. The original is the top right, with the image that has the different dimensions other than the square ones around it. And so it was able to recreate the aesthetic. It understood what kind of camera would be used at this time period, and the fashion of the men and how they would be posed in front of the camera. It didn't understand the fact that Benjamin Pap could possibly be a Black presenting man. Like, from this image, it looks like his skin is a bit darker, and all of these men around the ones that they created were appeared to be white, fairer skinned. But what it was able to retain and what it was not was really interesting to me. And so I wanted to annotate it and kind of use it as a sort of scientific practice, which it really was for me, of studying how does AI see us based off the ways that we have presented ourselves to it. Are there other slides in this? Okay, yeah. So this one was me studying spaces, and what does it mean if I use language about spaces and recreate those spaces? And then what I would also do is add context to those images. So not only use the way that they were captioned inside of the public domain of landscape here in Ethiopia, but also who took the picture, giving it that additional context and seeing how it was able to use that context and change it a bit. And this one, what you can see here is in the Red Cross pamphlet. So understanding the difference between different platforms. What I noticed when I would use different platforms like Red Cross pamphlet or in a travel magazine, you may not be able to see it so well here, but with Red Cross, because that is a charitable organization, it wouldn't romanticize it in the same way that it would if I said travel magazine or National Geographic. And then if I also use the race of the different photographers here, you don't get to see it, but in some other images you can. It would reveal the faces of the subjects if it was by an African photographer, if the location was in Africa. And for me, that represented a sort of comfort between the photographer and the subject when communities are the same of both roles. And then when it was a white photographer, that's when I would see the backs of the subjects. And so for me, that represented a bit of a voyeurism. But these were I didn't do it enough times to really to say that confidently, but these were like sort of nuances that I was noticing in the imagery of the ways that it understood context and what does it mean when you add context to images. Are there any others? Okay, so this one, yeah, so again, so just images, seeing how it it reimagines the idea of woman washing clothes in Congo in this time period. And so what does it look like in the original? I don't remember which one was the original, but or the brown one likely was the original, just because that's the only different one. But seeing how well it could still, like, what does it know about these women? What might they wear? Which was very similar to really what they actually do wear. But the fact that it clearly it couldn't imagine that the original photo was something that was taken much further back, and it had a different coloring in its photograph. But it was just so interesting for me. And this was, again, back in this was a year ago. So this was very early stage generative AI compared to where it is now, and to see how it was very well able to just recreate these images now. If I were to go in, it would be even more higher fidelity. But I think for me, this was just interesting to see the quality in which it could reimagine our archive, and also just create imagery in general. So maybe we can, yeah, just go into the conversation now. Hopefully that gave enough context.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to start things off. Again, I'm Julian Brash from the Department of Anthropology. I want to thank everyone for inviting me, and thank Ari for her really thought-provoking work. There's a lot, I think, as an anthropologist and an urbanist, I could say about this, and things that kind of makes me think about, and there's sort of techniques that it makes me think that we could use to understand, the archive, as Ari puts it. But one thing I just wanted to start off with was from an anthropological perspective. One of the things that anthropologists have tried to do is think about the nature of that archive. Kind of one of the things that ethnographers and anthropologists do is kind of create a sort of record of human behaviors and ways of understanding the world and practices. And obviously that record historically has been quite biased and focused on certain people and not others. One of the things anthropologists kind of across the board have tried to do is expand the purview of that record to include people who were excluded, and also to sort of fill in the gaps. For example, within Europe or North America, anthropologists have looked at groups of people who were typically not, whose histories and understandings of the world weren't really part of the record. And so I think that this work really, helps us think about that and kind of makes us think about the way in which that record is created and kind of reproduced, and then, how it will continue to kind of develop over time in kind of interesting ways, but also kind of worrisome ways. There's, I think this allows us to think about and be aware of how, this kind of compendium of knowledge and words has these kinds of biases, and think about it. But it also, becomes, the images that Ari is creating themselves become part of the record. So there's this almost like recursive quality, and that makes me think about how AI may, sort of reproduce certain distortions or biases or, systematic misrepresentations or, styles of representation that might cause harm to people. So I think that's it's a very interesting, there's a way in which AI and its ability to explore that record, I think, really calls into question, what kind of knowledge we have of ourselves and, others, of kind of humanity as a collective, and what the nature of that knowledge is and has been and will be moving forward. So I'll stop there. There's more I'd be happy to say, but I want to, see what other people think.
I'll jump in if I may, just to sort of add a question on top of that, because I think it's one of the terms that comes up in some of your work. And so just briefly, again, I'm Charlotte Kent. I'm in the Department of Art and Design. My question, just based on, sort of Julian's presentation there, is you talk about this sort of computational anthropology, and I guess I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that, and how you first just sort of came up with that term and like why those choices, especially given your interest in words and how words themselves make worlds. And so the kind of the world that you're trying to posit by using that term. And then, of course, just sort of what you think about it in relationship to your work and to this landscape in which we find ourselves at the moment.
Yeah, thank you both for bringing both of those ideas. And I think for me, it is very intentional to use those words, computational anthropology, because anthropology is clearly the study of people, and then computational of using the computer, which I use synonymously for AI, online society, data. How can I use technology to study the ways that we have existed within this world? And I also wanted to do it in a way where I think it's important for people that are not trained inside of certain professions to see that the way that they see the world could also be very similar to that training, but not to let that certification gatekeep them from even being able to imagine that space. And as someone who doesn't have a degree in anthropology, but studies people rigorously through texts and books and all of that, I think for me, it was, as a technologist and an artist, how do I create space for people to allow themselves to see that too? And not just use these technologies in a way where we're just replicating the way that they're designed, but let's actually think about the design. Like it's almost like I don't know what word would be like a technopology, using anthropology as a technopology to study technology. So that was my intent in going into it. And I think what I also want to say, especially in Julian and you exploring, like, what does it mean now to use AI to study, to just observe the world? I think it's also really important to understand that this is just one lens. I think this is just the way that it can understand African women in Congo in the 1920 to 1940. It's only based off of the way that it has decided what information it allows into the data set. Like it's purely a lens of a group of people and what they decide they want to understand about other people. If someone else in a whole other part of the world decided they want to create something that would create a visualization of Ben Affleck, that guy could look like a whole bunch of stuff if they don't have the right images, right? So it's just understanding, it's all of this is just culture. AI is just a culture and it's representing that one culture. And I want to study that one culture because that's the culture we all are so deeply immersed in, but let's study what that actually is.
If I can jump in here just for a second on that point, especially because mentioning the photography and looking back at these sort of earlier photographs from the 20s and 50s, if I remember correctly, the dates on sort of what you were focused on. It brought to mind the work I happen to know through another avenue of this independent researcher, Patricia Hickling, who's done work on the early photography in Senegal, which obviously is a different culture and some different context. But one of the things that she pointed out that had deeply, deeply influenced the photography that was being produced in the sort of decades in which you're speaking about, in Senegal at least, was the way in which when photographers first arrived in the 1890s, it was white men, and specifically French, who were really bringing in the 1890s a very, very explicitly, if ever there had been an explicitly like imperial and colonialist gaze, that was that moment, to this. And they were doing it in terms of photographing. They were labeling their photographs, often misnaming the titles of people within the communities and so forth. But the framing in which that they produced these photographs then became these sort of identity cards in the sense of like visiting cards, the way people would use photographs as a part of like visiting and that they would share them, which then became this part of studio photography within the area itself, which then became this sort of commercial practice that led all of the people who lived there to emulate what had been produced upon first arrival and then being disseminated within this particular context. And sort of she just in her research, she just sort of tracks this phenomenon. And I was struck by it when I was looking. I had forgotten about this research. And so I sort of revisited it briefly before our conversation, because I was struck by the way in which one of the things your images do in relationship to these generators is specifically kind of show, like, it reminded me of that history and then how this is reproducing it now in this slightly other different but similar technological context. And knowing that those are open access like those are open access images, that those images are part of the data sets that are producing the images that you're dealing with. And I'm just sitting there going like, this is just layer upon layer of the type of issue and knowledge production that Julian was talking about and that you're obviously addressing as well. And I guess one of the, questions I have is, all of that at first glance seems dismaying, right? And like it creates this sort of rabbit hole of more of the same. And yet one of the things that you have also talked about is the way in which using these generators has provided you with the ability to explore aspects of yourself in ways that have been freeing or interesting or exciting. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that, like, I don't even want to make it a binary, but like I'm going to use the word dichotomy, like that dichotomy of experience.
Yeah, I love that, because I think at the core of really kind of what you're saying, for me, I think of is self-awareness. I think those people that were going onto that continent, onto the Frenchmen that were going to this part of the world, I don't think they thought of themselves as colonizers or imperialists. They're not trying to do harm. They're just I would say that they could just be fascinated by this world, and they're trying to use the language that they know to put that into boxes. It's a scientific practice for them. It's not so much of like this ill intent thing. Hopefully, maybe there's some power dynamic within that. But I think for me, it's also important to kind of just like, let's just look at people and think of what their experience might have been, and not always label things as harmful when it might not have been intentfully so, but understand that the effects could be harmful, but just what are they actually doing? And I think for them, they lacked self-awareness to understand that it's not fair for them to label an entire culture with their own way of seeing it, or at least it's not the best for us to just grasp whatever is the dominant narrative and say that that's the truth. So it's either or. It's like, it's really a matter of them being self-aware, but also us being self-aware of what are we using. Don't just rely on this stuff and think that whatever comes out of it is representative of truth. It's just a representative of a culture's truth. And so for me, that's what I was trying to do. I'm not entering this space of AI thinking that it's ever going to be something that can universally exists as a right or wrong logic. It's simply just a representation of a culture. When I was using it for my own identity, again, I'm using the language that may not be inherent to my own world and culture, but I'm using whatever I can to manipulate the way that I look with the tools, understanding that these are the parameters of the tools and how can I use the tool as best fit for me. So as I was exploring that and created my own personalized model, which means I have created my own small data set with my face so that I could use my likeness and manipulate it and change it and make it something else. So I created my own personalized model. And what I do with that model is it's labeled, the idea is a checkpoint. So we have this large data set, then I create my own personalized model and I say, use this large data set in general to for me to play with, but I'm really just trying to focus on my likeness. And so I use words to adjust my likeness to make me to give me really a whole different lifestyle. I existed inside of Egypt. I was a supermodel in Cairo, I was on the yacht, drinking champagne. Like I was lavishly living and I loved it. It was amazing, but it also really shifted my psyche because at the time before that, I never really paid attention to my identity in that way. I always kind of I didn't realize how much I was performing this idea of, okay, this is how people see Ari. This is what they expect from her. If I ever act differently, then it's going to shock people. So let me not do that. I was really just staying in my lane. And I think by playing around with that and posing in ways, wearing clothes I never would have worn, hair, and also just seeing me represent myself with a different form of confidence than I ever had, it made such a shift. And I think I realized in that moment that, oh, identity is really this playground. It's really a performance for all of us. And if we just give ourselves that permission to be whatever we want to be and know that we can, that's really liberating. And so for me, I got insight into that very early on. And now I'm seeing friends explore that with things like Yearbook AI, where they just upload a few images of themselves. And now they have all these like nostalgic images. And I asked one of my friends, like, how does this feel for you? What does it mean to see yourself represented in a way where you don't present yourself that way, but you could if you wanted to? And she was like, I never even thought of that. It's like it's this moment that I think people are starting to realize, where it's just a matter of the stories that we're telling ourselves when it comes to identity. And I think it's stories that we tell ourselves with everything, but with identity and with technology, it's really something I think a lot about.
That's really interesting from just sort of I hadn't really thought about that, this idea of kind of how to imagine yourself or your life kind of like otherwise than it is. And of course, being able to see it in image form is very concrete and like has a, kind of visual quality that just kind of whatever daydreaming might not. But I wanted to ask you a question. One of the things, it's not someone who doesn't really know a huge amount about AI, but, I've thought about it a little bit in terms of, there's a sort of shift in anthropology towards what's under the rubric of post-humanism, where we're kind of sort of decentering the human as both the subject of our research, but also a bit like as the entity doing the viewing, as it were. And you've referred to this a couple times. Like, how do you think we should think about, or how do you think about, like, what, one of the things that your pieces do is they raise this question of like how we as humans are being sort of seen in a certain kind of way by a non-human entity that's, drawing on human material in the phrase of the archive. But I'm just interested in this, idea of like being, what's doing the viewing? Like how do we think about, like, because we've talked about the gaze, like who's the gazer in your work, and like what does that mean for how we think about ourselves and, kind of imagery and depictions of, sort of semi-fictionalized humans and so on, if that makes sense. What's on the, who's behind the camera now, I guess, is the question.
The camera is the culmination of we could say Western world, that's pretty wide, but we could probably narrow it down a little bit to the American world, North American world, even though not all the big tech CEOs are North American, but it's generally that mentality. And so to know that this AI is coming out of predominantly North American tech leaders, it's that data set. It's how they're grabbing the internet around the world. It's what they have access to. The fact that so much of even the data corpus on text was coming from Reddit, like that's a really specific cultural choice to use Reddit as opposed to any other, forum. I understand that that's probably where there's most text at any other forum, but still that's a very cultural choice. So I think the gaze is really, it's hard to identify how small to go, but I think I could safely say it's North American data as the gaze, and that becomes the camera. And now whenever we use this technology, which if it had come anywhere else, we would have called it the Ghanaian AI or the Brazilian AI. We would have labeled it with where it came from and who made it. So because it's coming from this idea of a centered culture, there's no labeling because there's no self-awareness of the people that are creating it. They just assume that the way that they think is normal. It's right. It's what everyone else should be thinking. And so I think that's the gaze, but I think that's also what I was trying to say to Charlotte too, is just like, it's just a gaze that is so unself-aware. Like the fact that I was watching this video with someone who is leading one of the biggest tech companies now, and they're exploring this idea of AGI, artificial general intelligence, and and the person that they were in a conversation with was exploring, what if we could create an AI that would actually alleviate all disputes and conflicts because it knows what's right and what's wrong? And it's like, in what scenario could that ever exist where it's a universal AI that has a logic that everyone can agree on? Logic is all based off of culture. It's all your way of thinking. Morality is all culture. So so back to your question, I think it's really just like, it's the group of people that are creating this, and it's predominantly the North American mentality.
But do you think that then we should mark it? I mean, Genevieve Bell, right? She talks a lot about the importance of marking in the sense of, to your point, we would say French AI, Buddhist AI. We would use those terms in it, but we don't say North American AI or Silicon Valley AI or USA AI. And do you think that would be helpful?
I think on both sides it would be helpful. It would be helpful for the people that are creating it. I mean, my theory about all of this is that I'm just not into this idea of a large language model that's a global model. I think that really does us a disservice. And I think it's really important for more cultures to see that this is a moment where every culture can create something that represents their way of thinking. And let's use that. If you want to operate from that lens, I don't think it's fair to have this sort of like validity and hierarchy between cultures, because that's what exists right now. It's what's always existed. And it's just becoming more permanent now with automation. It's like, okay, well, this group of people, they've always been the dominant, they've been seen as the colonizers and all this stuff, but they also just have such a lack of awareness because they really think that this way is right. And it's like, no, there are other people that have different ways of being. And I think we need different AIs, smaller AIs. All of them need to be smaller and just focus on your way of thinking as opposed to trying to create something that is everything.
I'm curious, as a programmer, how you imagine that would work, since one of the reasons these generators work at all is because of their enormous data sets.
Well, I think it actually works better. Like, as someone who has studied this, what happens is, even like what we were talking about earlier, the data, you were bringing up an amazing example of that data is what's coming in and influencing these outputs. It's data that was mislabeled. It's not culturally correct as far as its nuance. What actually, what performs better as far as data to models is very clean data. As soon as you have anything that's off in the data, the whole model is messed up. It's not going to output in a quality way. Right now, we're thinking more quantity as opposed to quality. So anything that you do, I was just even reading this paper, I wish I could credit the source, but it was creating an analogy between a baseball coach and a team versus an AI large language model and something very specific. The baseball coach has an insight that is different from the pitcher. You can, if you are trying to be thinking all these different ways at one time, it's dispersed energy, as opposed to if you are this one thing and you do that really, really well, you know how to do it well. It's the same thing with modeling. If you have a model that's supposed to text to sound and also text to create videos and also do images to turn those into videos, if you're doing all of those things simultaneously, you're not doing anything well. If you break it off and try and create one data set that's really good at turning text to images because it has that captioning and it understands the language paired to images optimally, and then you have another data set that really understands this is how images are captioned, this is how it would translate well into video. It's right now we're thinking just so big and messy as opposed to thinking, let's be really efficient and small, and just like create these small models that are very specific for the task that they're meant to be for.
So is that what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but is it a matter of just the data set? And again, I say this as someone fairly non-knowledgeable about the kind of nuts and bolts of AI, or is it about the kind of mediating algorithms and programming itself? Because mostly we've been talking about mostly in terms of, the data that's being drawn at and its, narrowness or width or biases and so on. But I'm wondering if the sort of mediating technology itself, what kind of role it plays in perhaps like addressing or reproducing these kinds of, biases and distortions.
Yeah, I wonder if you can separate them. Because right now I'm thinking more of like an analogy to nature. Like the conversation I was having yesterday, what I was talking to someone about was really how all sentient life, like all forms of life, are data conglomerates. You are constantly studying data around you. Trees are studying data. They're studying weather. They're studying the insects that are crawling inside of them, all of that. So if we were to expect trees to have a bunch of access to traffic and now it should know how to drive a car, it's like it has its own purpose. So I think we can think of that in the same way of technology. It's sentience. All of it is coming together and studying data and performing for that specific task. So that's as far as, that's just the way that I'm thinking about it. It's hard to know exactly if it's purely the data, if it's purely the way that the data is being used. But I think when we think in a biomimic way of like, how does the natural world work? I think we can create analogies that we see examples of in the natural world.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I referred before to sort of post-humanism shift in anthropology, and one central book in that kind of move was by Eduardo Cohn. It's called How Forests Think.
Yeah.
And his claim is that forests are this kind of information processing, system in which, certain, there's this kind of property of emergence, where they're able to, kind of react to stimuli and act, and so on. And it just kind of, for anthropologists, it's really expanded the way we think about, what it means to be human, because there are all these, non-human entities that have properties that we have assigned to humans, but also how we as, entities that relate to those other entities, are not, there's not this hard and fast boundary between, ourselves and, viruses or forests or technology. And I think that's, one of the things I was trying to get at before is this kind of where the gaze is, it's a non-human gaze. And like, that's a really interesting thing to think about. It's not just the data that's in those data sets that's, portraying us in like your artwork, but there's something else going on. And it's just an interesting thing to think about as we try to understand the world from the perspective of like non-human entities, whether that's like a dog or a forest or an AI. And I think it does a certain, particularly in light of, issues like climate change, where, we have to sort of rethink our role in the world. Like, it helps us think a little differently about how humans relate to non-human entities, and maybe, a little more humility, I guess.
Yeah.
I wonder if I like this idea of just talking about metaphors for a little bit, if we could, especially because of the way you brought up sort of how you're sort of trying to think in these different ways. And especially in the context that I think it's actually been so important in the realm of technology, because in thinking through problems, often we're thinking them through in terms of constructs, right? And often certain metaphors sort of dominate the way we're thinking, in particular right now, just because of another topic I was a part of last week. I'm remembering how when Radio Perlman was trying to, was asked to solve this issue around information being processed, the whole way it had been being conceived was this relay race. And so when she comes up with the spanning tree protocol, right, it's because she changes the metaphor from it being a relay race, which intuitively makes so much sense, like information goes from here to you relay, right, to thinking about it in terms of a tree. And as soon as she made that shift, she was able to come up with this protocol. She got the patent. She's got this lovely poem that she included as a part of the patent, right? It's just such an interesting, lovely example of that. And transforms, right? Like, it becomes crucial to the internet revolution of the 1990s, right? So I was just wondering if in your own work, especially because of the way in which you're moving between, the work as a programmer and, your work with photography and working with these as an artist, if there's metaphors that you've found and then suddenly switched and had that open up something for you in this kind of creative, imaginative work sort of way that is part of what the arts do in the end, kind of help contribute to the world in which we live.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you said the constructs, because I think that is the analogy that I have right now, that models, if they are broken down and more specific, and we look at the natural world, if I look at it in that way, then that's how it can make it make sense. And I think rationalization is really the constructs that we're relying on to validate this idea. So, but to get to your question, I don't know if there was a shift to something else. Like, I had an analogy initially and then I shifted to something else, but I did gain an analogy as I was playing with generative AI tools. And I had also been a lifetime artist, and also watching artists that don't have the same comfort that I do with technology feel such a discomfort with generative AI. And the analogy that I started to create was a sort of paradigm of thinking of ourselves as a human, but also as a creator. The timeline of it kind of as like ants, bees, and trees. And what I've told students that I've shared this with is we kind of start off as ants. Like, all of us, when we are born and we have our own societies around us, our family, our parents, all of them are influencing our ways of thinking. They all design our ways of thinking. We can't really know things unless we're exposed to them. So that's our ant way. But also, as far as a creative, everything you create, it's a matter of brick by brick. It's a micro, small labor. And that's what ants are. They're these tiny little beings that are coming together collectively and creating something larger. Then we go to bees. And if you think of yourself as a human, eventually you start leaving your family's home, you start leaving your initial elementary school friend group, you start being exposed to other people. And that is now this sort of hybrid of different mentalities that you're blending together to come up with something new. And bees are exactly that. Like, it takes 25,000 trips between a bunch of flowers and their home to create a little bit of honey. So thinking about this sort of alchemy of blending a bunch of cross-pollination, blending a bunch of different things, and also as a creative, you are someone that is constantly studying the world around you. You're studying other artists, you're listening to podcasts, you are just watching the world, and all of those things are influencing your way of being. And then eventually all of that comes together and you create things with it. Maybe you create a life or you create an art piece, but it all is this ants, bees to trees kind of movement that I see. And so when I was thinking about that as far as an artist and with AI, I think there are many artists that feel so validly worried about this revolution but I think it's about things that I don't even think they understand it's about. I think for one, it's about money. It's that these companies are being able to extract their styles and make money off of it without anything to them. But I also think there is this idea of art that we have in today's world where it's not actually art, it's really design. So if an artist is honing in on a certain style and they create a signature look, and now they're worried that something else, a computer, can come and generate that look, that's not exactly art. That is a style. It's a design that you're performing and profiting off of. And it's not a judgment. It's more of just like understand that that's what it is, versus what I find art to be is really you are constantly, it's curiosity. You're exploring new things, you're blending things together. And that's what artists are always doing. No one is coming up with anything on their own in their own little corner. Everyone is copying and mimicking it and bringing their own style into it. And so I think when you have that shift of understanding, okay, these tools cannot take the human creative power away. It's really just another tool that's automating what we do in our own artistic ways, but now we can use that automation and create new things. It's new levels of creativity. It doesn't replace human creativity. So that's been one analogy I've had of what does it mean to be an artist pre-AI, and then an artist that's using AI, very much seeing yourself as a bee and also seeing this computer as a super bee that helps you become an even more super bee.
So I'm really glad you brought some of that stuff up, because it was one of the things I was hoping we would maybe talk about a little bit in terms of the art and this moment in art that these generators are sort of like, I think, forcing us to confront. I mean, there's a number of things that's forcing us to confront, but the way in which you went through all that, right? And this shift away from sort of style or design per se as being the focus really actually speaks in this enormous way to what's happened in for modern and contemporary art, right? This notion of imitation and style influence. There's a list of words that one could like sort of go into, right? Became less the thing, and then somehow being radically new, right? Having your own idea, your own thought, which maybe sort of quasi culminates in conceptual art, where it is the idea and not the object itself that is the work, as it were. And I've been struck by the fact that with these generators, we're really confronted when we look at the types of outputs that are being produced by that dichotomy again, right? I would argue, if I may, hopefully I won't have to argue it, but like that your work really falls into this sort of conceptual practice, in the sense that it's not the single object that is the purpose of what you are doing so much as presenting this idea, and these objects sort of just hold that there. And in fact, necessitate multiples of them, right? The set of the multiple images is crucial to the ability to do this. And I think that notion of sets is really important too, versus this other anxiety that people are having around the imitation stuff, right? Like this notion that the output is like, oh, it is like, it stands alone as an exemplar of something I have done. And it's this, and it revisits this kind of split in art making practices that has been a part of the conversation for a solid 50 years now, right? And blah, blah, blah. Sorry it's taking so long to say all this. I'm startled in a certain way by the fact that so much of the conceptual works that have been produced in this context, right, where the idea is driving it, is also showing some of the difficulties with these generators, some of their potentials as well, right? And the way in which the idea drives what you then see, and yet the object is also, to your point earlier, being driven by a set of ideas that are not exclusively like you being the imaginative worker producing this, right? That is like calling upon this massive, unmarked, cultural, normative knowledge base. And I feel like those are two very, maybe I'm not going to be able to express it. I feel like those are two very different problems that are somehow all constantly being lumped together. There's this one side, which is the anxieties around what the conceptual projects show us. And there's this other very different anxiety around what happens when we look at an output that is explicitly this likeness, right? And that part of the thing around so much of what's going on here is this challenge, just to go back to words for a moment, of we're calling it all the same thing. Mm-hmm. And we're calling it all AI, right? And they're different forms, right? The different types of generators make a difference. The different types of algorithmic systems make a difference in terms of what you're going to see, what you're going to get, how you're participating, and what kind of culture and language. The types of outputs make a difference. And so there was a question there long ago.
But I think that kind of goes to this idea of art versus design. Yeah, I think I got it. Like the sets are important because they show a consistency. And I think oftentimes people are creating with these tools and there's no consistency. We're purely relying on the technology, and that's being labeled as AI art. In the same way that someone is using this in a conceptual way where it's not about the technology. As for me, it's as a technologist, it's never about what tool I'm using, as a musician, it's never about what instrument. It's just about how do I get this idea and bring it into life. And I think that for me feels like art versus how do I create something that people expect, or how do I, I think there's another side that's not so much curious and artistic, but it's more of replicating, like you were saying, or mimicking or performing, or it's not really an expression, it's more of just a production. And I think those are different forms of what's all being lumped into as AI art. Not just because you're using an AI and using Midjourney and writing some language and making an image, that doesn't make it AI art. It doesn't make it art. It makes it a production of AI. But when you are thinking very intentionally about how do I, and it doesn't have to be that you know what's going to come out of it. It's just the fact that you are curious about something and you're exploring it. I think that is the moment where it shifts into being art, where it's not so much about how can I use this to do something. It's more of how can I explore and learn and create, be curious.
There's a sociologist, I'll come up with his name in a moment, sorry. But he sort of posits that there's this that there's sort of people approach their life sort of through either self-enhancement or self-transcendence. And self-enhancement is often trying to cultivate more knowledge, but more power, but more like it's sort of that particular lineage. And self-transcendence is this kind of curiosity and trying to, and that these are really sort of not easily brought together perspectives, approaches to existence and experience. And that the sort of self-enhancement mode, to just speak to Julian's sort of ecological things that we are all aware we have to consider, makes it very, very difficult to shift some of our behaviors around, to shift the behaviors that are enabling the continuation of the climate breakdown that we're having. and I keep hearing you speak and thinking about the way, and so much of what you're talking about is this sort of self-transcendence, just using the terms. I mean, I have no opinion on these terms, right? Like, but the self-transcendence sort of approach, but that's not all that this tool can be used for, right? This tool can also be used for this pathway of self-enhancement in this construct. And I think that's one of the challenges that at least I look to for in some of the art projects that are using these tools to try and address. It's like, we're faced with both of these things happening, and there seems to be no current social basis on which to address that very problematic attitude, and the impact that's going to have. These aren't small tools. They are largely available globally. They are, the more images that get produced, the more they go into the data sets. Yes, they're expensive in certain parts of the world, and they're very cheap over here for some people in the United States, right? Like there's all kinds of disparities. And if we want them to do this thing that I think you're talking about in terms of self-transcendence and being able to cultivate curiosity and self-awareness and some of those things, there are guardrails that need to be put into place.
Oh, that's the way I have to come in, but I'm like, what were you about to say? What guardrails?
Well, I mean, people are positing guardrails, like that there should be a regulatory, like at least like in the US, a federal regulatory agency, right? I mean, people are trying to figure this out, and I think I'll just say lastly, like I think this is actually one of the reasons I'm so grateful for artists who are really embedded in these tools and trying to do some of the types of projects that you are doing, because I think that's a more helpful conversation than this kind of Munch scream about the world is ending. And AGI is concerning, and I'm glad you're the type of person who's having those conversations, but it can't just be Terminator anxiety. We have to actually address like the reality of the fact that these systems are going to be here.
Yeah, I think it's important to critique with imagination. I'll leave it at that. I know you have questions to ask.
And on that note, I hate to be the gatekeeper here of our closed system design. I'm very grateful for this very stimulating and rich discussion, and it really fits so nicely in this overall interdisciplinary approach, right? Adi, you're just amazing, and we only scratched the surface with your work, right? Because you're also in the musical realm, and so that would take another session, and so we might have to have you back. But we want to be inclusive, and despite our audience being somewhat invisible, yet another sort of choice, right? What I suggest now is I maybe read out a couple of questions, because Christopher Parker has, correct me if I'm wrong, Alyssa, but I think he is in a creative writing class and has 25 students with him. And of course, we have also another 25 or odd guests here in our webinar. So I would suggest if anyone has any questions, Christopher Parker's class was firing it up. And so what I suggest is maybe I read a few questions that they had, and then I give you, Adi, and of course, Charlotte and Julian some time to also reflect on this, and then we'll take the next round. Does this sound like a good practice? And then we have about another 20 minutes, maybe a little short. Julian, was that a hand or just a nod? Great. So in Christopher's class, we had one question in terms of, do you think that AI limitations or prejudices about what we think a culture or race is can be a good analogy for human prejudice? Maybe a model to see and use in human form. So that was one question. Another one, since I was talking about gatekeepers, there are gatekeepers to rock and roll, opera, motion pictures, and gallery paintings. What or who is the gatekeeper for data sets in AI research? Does the AI keep the gate closed, right? And so you, I think, Charlotte, you just mentioned that with who is the gatekeeper, right, in your last comment, and should there be a federal agency? But can we see that a bit broader? And a third one that I want to bring up here goes back to sort of the photos and sort of photographers in the early colonial period, right? You mentioned French explorers using the language they know to describe what they explore. And how do we go outside the box, in quotation marks, of our own language and paradigms? So the first one about prejudices, right, and the limitations, and using this as human practice and prejudices. The second, gatekeepers overall, and the third one in terms of the knowledge and so that these not language paradigms.
I think they all could be answered pretty similarly. I think it all comes down, I think what was mentioned earlier of intelligence is culture. The way that we understand the world is based off the culture in which we're embedded in, what has influenced us. And also something I've been wanting to talk about, but I'm kind of scared too, because I need to do so much research and validation, but I really believe that each of us are an AI. Like each of the ways that our brains are designed, we are our own little AI. So if we think of the ways that we have blind spots, we make assumptions about people based off of what they're wearing, we judge people, all of that is just based off of our own little understanding of the world. And that's exactly what AI is doing. And that's why I'm saying it's not a matter of, for me, it's not a matter of trying to create a super AI. I think that's impossible. And I think that's a shame for us to even attempt to do. I think it's important for us to validate and respect that people see things differently. There is no objectivity. Everything empirical is all about observation, which means it's your perception. And so if we stop looking at these AIs as a form of truth, as something that is gatekeeping, if we give it less power, these super AIs, and instead give ourselves and our own cultures and communities more power by creating something that reflects who we are, then there is always a power dynamic within society. But I think at least if we just validate ourselves and create, and even like with rock and roll and opera and things like the Oscars and those hashtags of Oscars so white, it's like, if we look at what we're doing, we're really elevating and validating this one culture and trying to fit in, as opposed to respecting who we are and being happy with who we are and creating something that encompasses who we are. And I think that can be done with AI too.
Thank you so much, Adi. Charlotte and Julian, do you want to respond to that also?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one of the things that I really loved about Adi's work from the point of view of, a social scientist is that, and it kind of gets to the question of like how we sort of identify prejudice. It seems to me that like what I really loved about it was the way in which in both pieces, Adi kind of isolates the difference that certain terms make. And I think that's really useful just from understanding culture, as a kind of circulation of like statements or texts of different kinds of sort of seeing the difference that certain kinds of terms make is really, it might identify prejudice, but it might also just help us understand how, whoever we are, and obviously that's a complicated and fraught question in this context, how we understand different characteristics. And for someone who, studies culture, which can be very hard to kind of measure, this is a really interesting kind of, another tool in the toolkit, I think, to see, the difference that saying you're a, tennis player or Ghanaian or whatever it might make, what are the cultural characteristics that people associate with that identity? We all have our ideas about it, but this helps us kind of, see that in a more kind of, systematized way. So those stereotypes maybe, or those associations may have problems, but it's really interesting to understand what they might be. So I think that's a really productive kind of avenue that comes out of this.
I think I would just add that one of the challenges that immediately comes to mind in terms of being able to make more of these that represent more different cultures is the cost involved. And that there's some barriers just there in terms of who can participate in producing more of these, it would seem to me. And so there's that part of it. And then I guess I can't help but think that, I fundamentally agree with you. I think this is just this type of technology, and it's here in society, and we need to deal with it. It is not, it doesn't need to take over. it's a very useful media hype right now, right? It always is. Whenever you use the word AI, it used to be used in terms of robots, then it became used in terms of surveillance technologies, then it got used. Like the term AI just always gets planted on top of whatever is the most recent, scary, seemingly authoritarian tech tool, right? And the way in which we have anxieties about the way in which it reflects back to us who we might be and intelligence in various different ways, which is one of the reasons the very term artificial intelligence is a term I have great issues with. And you know, there were other alternatives on the table years ago, and yet the term AI has sort of stuck, and now we're stuck with it. And I think it does a disservice to the types of conversations we're even like articulating need to be had, because you say artificial and you say intelligence, and people are already running in certain directions, right? But to that point, if it's a part of society, and then I think real questions have to get asked in terms of, what do we as citizens in various different places want this to be doing in our society? And that's one of the reasons why I was talking about, you know, whether we call them gatekeepers or a regulatory service or whatever, this is always a complicated thing, right? Like the positive thing at one point about democracy was this notion that every few years people could vote yet again on who they thought should be in charge of certain types of decision making and representing them in that decision making process. That there are problems with the kinds of democracy that we are seeing, like no doubt, but that was one of the advantages. And it does seem to me as if this tool arriving as a part of society and being used in society in various different ways does ask us as a society to be like, where do you belong? Like, yes, let's take it as like, if we're an AI and you're an AI and we're all AIs, and here's this AI that's a tech tool, where does this AI belong? And how do we want it to participate on the playground that we're all in? And I think that that's going to continue to shift and change, just the same way the pharmaceutical industry has continued to shift and change and what we want and expect of it. Ooh. Okay, she's back. I was like, oh no, I upset her so much she left.
Ari's like, I'm the gatekeeper. Bye, guys.
And so, you know, we use that term and it always has negative connotations, but there's also good ones. Gatekeepers also do good work in terms of educating. They also do, like in the arts, we saw this whole thing around anti-gatekeeping because of curators and museum people, but those are also the people who help people learn about new art practices and explain why this has been missing in the narrative and needs to now be an exhibition and you should come see it. These are also the people who care about works for decades and centuries to make sure that they're there for the next generation. Gatekeepers aren't always a negative presence.
And I think gatekeepers, one essential role of gatekeepers is to create a sense of trust between the consumer and the platform, institution, whatever it is. So gatekeepers are the ones that are making sure that whatever is coming out of their platform is consistent with what people expect, for better or for worse. I think when it comes down to the cost, like the things that you were saying of costs, and there was another big point that you had been making after costs, but at least with costs, I think that's also, and just generally AI, like labeling AI. And I think when it comes to cost, I think, again, it also goes down to large models versus small models. And when you have a small model, like Stable Diffusion, which is one of the biggest image generator tools, about a year ago, it cost $650,000 to create that. And when that was created, everyone went crazy in big tech. And people started doing layoffs because they saw these small companies exist and only use this little bit. 650 is a big amount of money generally, but it's not that big when it's able to disrupt an entire, the richest ecosystem, one of the richest ecosystems in the world. So if that big can do that, and now today, a year later, it costs $130,000 to create a whole model that can create images from text to images. I think that then shows, for one, how it's becoming a lot more accessible for a lot of people to create their own models, which means it's not, I think that's the most exciting part of it for me, is that this is a moment where different people from different backgrounds can now have a sort of agency where they don't need to rely on all these gatekeepers to let them in, but now fundraise a bit with your, people that believe in what you're doing, and you can create that. And then when it comes to AI, I think it's also just like this. We have these ideas about AI, but again, it's because the stories that have been told to us and that we have told ourselves. And I think so much of technology is really based off, the technologies that we have access to today are based off of sci-fi. Sci-fi are stories, it's narratives. And sci-fi creates 70% of the technology that we have today. Like, that's a correlation that's been direct for years. So if we have other people that, again, are critiquing the technologies that we have, but are being imaginative, like, how can this be something that's positive to us? How can this be something that transcends humanity? And we no longer have to fixate on these microtasks as ants, and now can synthesize as bees and be super bees, but also cultural bees. I think there's just so much opportunity. And if we let this fear, which is valid, but let it stop us from just imagining ways that this can empower us and help us. I think it's important to be cautious and regulate. And also what I want to say, sorry, jumping all over the place, but another thing that I wanted to say was I was in another panel, we were talking about regulation, and I've always been an advocate for ethics in technology, always, since even before I was in big tech. So that's never something that's a part of the things that I'm doing. And even inside of big tech, I was constantly asking, why are we creating these technologies? There's so much excitement around research when we don't even know how it's going to impact people. And we just create this stuff, open source it, and let anyone have access to it without any intention. So that's always a worry of mine. But I think it's been interesting how this has been released to the public with no regulation. It's fast, and the regulation could possibly interact with it. And as unsafe as it has been, it's also been important, because imagine if it had been contained and regulated by the gatekeepers. And these are gatekeepers that do not reflect the world. They reflect a really small group of people. And so they are the ones that are regulating it and making it safe for their own people, as opposed to everyone seeing what this is. And now everyone gets to have an opinion on how should this be regulated. Like, now it's out in the world, and now everyone can have an opinion. And now we can go back into regulation in a way where it's just more comprehensive of everyone that it could impact.
Thank you so much. And in the interest of time, we still have a couple of questions. So I have one relatively precise question by Will Pappenheimer that probably Adi or any one of you that studies that a bit more deeply could answer. The person was fascinated by it, and really the problematics of anthropology in association with linguistics. And the question is, if there is a study of metadata data linguistics and how it affects signification or representation. So if you do know, you could probably maybe pass that on to us or Alyssa, or put it in the chat. What sort of research is out there, and then my sort of closing remarks is sort of like to bunch up a couple of questions, and in line with what you guys just said in terms of gatekeeping, right? This transparency, representation. A lot of Christopher's students were asking to what extent it can be beneficial in societies. And so I would like you to sort of reflect in sort of a 30-second pitch, all of you, if you want, sort of Adi, Charlotte, and Julian, as your final remarks, because as Adi said, we've been all over the place, but it was very coherent. It was fascinating and so enriching. And so I just wanted you to take a moment here to pitch something. What should folks here take away?
Who should start? Oops, sorry.
I feel like maybe I'll go. I feel like Adi should probably be the last person to go, since we're here to sort of recognize her work. So I'll go first, and then Julian, and then maybe you can close it out, Adi. I'll say, I think it's really important, if you are having a fear or anxiety or anger reaction to some of these technologies, that's a really good sign that you should probably jump in and start using it and seeing what's happening. Because I think it's the experience of using it that can help figure out what part of the conversation you want to participate in. And I think this is a really important social conversation, as these tools are being used in so many different areas. And it's one that's going to be a part of our society and our politics and our culture in really meaningful ways. So any really intense feeling about it is deserving of engagement and then participating in the conversation. I don't think walking away is the right answer, precisely so that we can have more complex and critical conversations about what this tool that isn't going anywhere is going to be doing in our lives.
Yeah, I'll just briefly follow up on that. Just brings to mind for me another technology that kind of didn't have generate quite the same level of anxiety, but has been, kind of used for the purposes of empowerment, I guess, which is GIS and mapping, which when it first kind of was developed as kind of a technology that could be widely dispersed, I mean, was often used by, institutions and for all sorts of problematic uses, but also there was a big counter movement of community mapping, participatory mapping that used GIS and those tools to to create alternative representations of urban space and to sort of channel narratives and so on of people who might buy it. So it just might be interesting to look at parallels in the past where technologies have been taken up by communities in kind of positive ways that allowed them to pursue their own projects as a kind of model for this moving forward.
Yeah. I would say I wish I knew of a study on metadata and linguistics. I think that's a really, I think that's something that I just explored inherently to the project, but I don't know of a study that does that. So if you do find it, we'll send it over. I think I want to say two things. One is we have always been in a moment like this. Humanity is always in a moment where there's never like this likely, but there's always a shift that takes us out of what we are comfortable with and presents us into something new. And as creatures of habit, we don't like these shifts when they first happen. I remember when Facebook would change the color of like little parts of our app, and that everyone was in uproar because they changed a little thing that we were used to. So I think this is much bigger than that, but it's essentially the same thing of we don't like change, but it's here. And I agree with Charlotte of before you can critique something, at least just play around with it and see what it does. I think it's important to get to know something so you can have a valid critique of it, but you also might find that there's a lot of potential within it. And I think what I'm most excited about is the potential of, especially as it relates to what I was doing with my own identity, it really allowed me to like very clearly see that what we see about ourselves, especially as people that are not reflected in media, I'm thinking about people that just look differently than what's commonly in media, that has affected our psyche so much, where we don't see that we are capable of doing certain things or thinking certain ways or living certain lifestyles. And even people that are reflected, but maybe don't see their own kind of culture in dominant media. I think this is a moment where we can see things that we've never seen before and just watch how it shifts our psyche and allows us to just imagine more abundantly. So I'm really excited about that.
Thank you so much, everybody. It looks like we'll probably have a follow-up here at some point because we only scratched the surface here. And I certainly want to acknowledge my co-coordinator, Tim Gorman here. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And yeah, keep up the great work and especially these fascinating conversations that are so crucial for making sure that we embrace that in a critical and meaningful way. Thank you, everybody.
I just want to say thanks to everyone as well. And for those whose questions were unanswered or you want to learn more, Ari will be giving a presentation at 6 p.m. in the Siegel Gallery today. So please join us, ask your questions then. Otherwise, you can follow the galleries at Montclair State Galleries on social media and stay tuned for more. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all.